All right. Well, welcome to the slightly after lunch shift. Hope you guys had some lunch. The bagels were actually not bad. My name is Peter Groth. I am the VP and Chief Technology Officer for HP Compute. That would be Hewlett Packard Enterprise, for those who are not speaking in the acronyms. What we're going to talk about today, and as you heard Sean talk about in the last session, he actually let slip that, guess what, I'm going to invite him back up. We're going to talk a little bit about sustainability in compute. This is one of the probably most important things that we can talk about when it comes to compute and compute resources at this point in time. And the reason for why that is so important is if any of you have ever tried to get a hookup license for either water or power anywhere in the world, if you guys are not going into a colo, you will recognize that this is a very, very difficult thing to get. And the reason why is that IT fundamentally behaves very differently than any other industry in this world. Normally when you're a municipality, you basically start out by building infrastructure. You build roads, you build power grid, you build all those kind of things, and then you attract industry, and that industry employs a lot of people. It builds a service industry in your local community, and all that generates a tax base. When you run a data center, it looks very, very differently, because the number of employees is typically 10, maybe 12 if you're like really large. That doesn't generate a whole lot of tax revenue. And on top of that, what it does is that it's extremely wasteful. 25% of even the best run data centers in the world, 25% of the power, the water, and the resources that go in there are effectively not turned into an output, compute. It generates about 53 million metric tons of e-waste every single year. This is stuff that is hard to get rid of. This is stuff that further weighs down on the cost to the municipalities around them. And as a result to that, we are seeing the amount of regulations that are going in these environments to be just going through the roof. 254% in terms of increased regulations between 2014, 2015, and 2021. This is a massive environment to begin to navigate as any IT shop, especially when you're at scale. So when we at HPE was looking at these numbers and we were sitting and we were going through and saying, well, what do we do with the next generation of products? What does that need to accomplish outside of just, computing ones and zeros? What are the big thematic things that we need to be able to attack? We basically came up with three things. First and foremost, we need to be a lot better at managing this environment. We need to be fundamentally more secure. And last but not least, and this is the most important part, we need to be extremely optimized for what it is we're trying to get out on the other end. This means looking at workloads, looking at sustainability within the data center, and wrestling with how do we basically do a lot more with, frankly, a lot less. And so one of the big aha moments for us, and this is the first in a series of products that are planned and either announced or will be announced in the upcoming few months and quarters, is taking a radically different look at what does it actually mean to get workload performance. And so we partnered with Ampere for the RL300, which is part of our Gen 11 platforms, which is our latest generation of both Intel, AMD, and in this case also Ampere platforms. This is a radical rethink thanks to the technology enablement that has happened with the Ampere teams in and around thinking about how do I get the absolute most performance per watt. Because fundamentally, you got to ask yourself this question. If IT and IT output measured by workload entities is what drives my revenue as a service provider, can I afford, in a world where the market is becoming increasingly competitive, to spend 2 or 3 times the resources versus what I could spend just because I want to have a specific, almost religious thought about which server architecture and microarchitecture I should use. And so I'll invite Sean up in a moment, and Sean will go over some of the benchmarks. These benchmarks are actually, real live world benchmarks. This is not synthetic stuff we dreamt up in a lab. But the key piece here is that the mental picture of what sustainability in this world should look like is that you have the choice between doing all of your workloads in either one rack that sucks down, say, 12 kilowatts of power, in 2 racks that sucks down 24, or in 3 racks that sucks down 36. They all produce the exact same amount. So can you actually justify going and say, you know what, I am opinionated about which architecture I want? Because at the end of the day, while I'm all for making sure that we have a much more sustainable planet, the ecology and all the things that goes with it, this is fundamentally a conversation about economics. So if we take a look at what this system does, and I zoomed in specifically on your RL300, we have a lot of these products in the Gen 11 portfolio, but I thought this one was really interesting, both because it signifies a lot of the open technologies that we, through our sponsorship work at OCP, have nurtured in over the last 3-4 years. But it also shows a really great story about how you do just that, a lot more with a lot less. 128 cores, industry-leading wattage points, scale from the core to the edge. It really comes down to, as we were saying before, a management experience, which we, on these products, which are specifically optimized for people like you, offers a choice, like any other product in our Gen 11 portfolio does. Do you wish to go with a proprietary ILO-based management environment, which is what HPE has been working on and been bringing to market for the last 20 years, award-winning, all the things that comes with that? Or would you rather like to go down a path of being open BMC, control your own security, etc.? Further, because of the processing technology that's in there, we are seeing a continuous improvement in the workloads themselves. This was on the third pillow. Here's how we optimize for your workload. Very specifically, the Ampere Alta and Alta Max processors. When we are looking at modern style web scale workloads, and you'll say, what are those? Well, it's anything from web servers, AI analytics, all those kind of things. But if you want to actually see what they really are, all you kind of sort of like have to go and do is go and take a look at what AWS uses their gravitons for, right? Because every single workload that Amazon runs on those has been heavily optimized, because guess what? Amazon understands economics as well. So they've sat down, they've done the math, they've figured out that they can essentially use up to 2/3 less CapEx to generate the same amount of revenue out the other way. And so they're obviously going, wonder if we can optimize those software workloads a little bit more, because that's even more profit margin for us. So that's really what is in the core of the product. On top of that were all the things that you heard Sean talk about in the last session, things like predictable performance, the way that the processor is laid out. There is no such thing as a power capping going on, because the processor physically doesn't use as much wattage as it physically are capable and plumbed to do, which means there is no such thing as, jitter whenever you're moving from one thread to another. As a matter of fact, there is no hyper-threading in there, which again, when it comes to these styles of workloads, makes it extraordinarily efficient and highly predictable. Every single time you launch a new thread, you basically get yourself a new core. When you get a new core, you get exactly the same amount of resources as the other cores have, and they're all private, which means that you can, if you're running, say, a containerized workload, you can essentially just continue to spawn containers, give every one of them a core, and now all of them will have exactly the same amount of resources at any given point in time. So this is, at its core, technology but in the larger context is here to serve one thing and one thing only, which is around how do we radically optimize the amount of resources, meaning expenses, in the data center that we use in order to produce a certain amount of revenue. So yes, it's technology, but it's also ecology and it's also economics. You will say, well, what does it run? So these are just a pluck out of the different workloads that at this point in time have been optimized and that we are benchmarking on an ongoing basis. These are workloads that actually are not hand-picked. These are the ones that are running in production. If you want to see them, by all means come and test drive with us. If you don't want to come and test drive with us, just try it out on a Graviton instance. This stuff is all there as a service. This is the stuff that you guys are going to be competing against. And it's not hard to stand up. All of this stuff shakes straight out of the box. The ecosystem is in place. So with all that said, I do want to invite Sean up to the stage. Mr. Varley. Come on, give him a round of applause. We're dragging him up here again. Sean, why don't you go in? I mean, I'm going to give you the clicker. And I know that you prepared a few benchmarks just to kind of like, if nothing else, make this real. So, Mr. Varley, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Peter. I did get a driver's license on this earlier, so hopefully I can do it. Okay, thanks again to HP for having me up. It's a real honor. An absolutely extraordinary partner here and partnership between our companies. So getting right to it, let's talk about some benchmarks. And these sort of back up the performance and the power efficiency that we see with Ampere processors versus the legacy x86 ecosystem. And in these cases, I'm borrowing again, if any of you were here earlier, the typical web components that drive a 3 or 4 tier web application architecture. So front-end Nginx, a caching layer with key value stores in Redis, the actual object caching layer in Memcached, and then the back-end database is MySQL. This shows you that extreme power efficiency. In this case, I want to show you a couple of things. There is almost a 500%. So we're talking about a massive change in performance per watt, which is the efficiency, versus the x86 ecosystem here. And that is repeated on lots of applications, right? So this is an amazing transformational kind of metric, because we're not just measuring performance, we're also measuring power at the system level, at the socket level. All of that combined gives you this kind of efficiency, and that's what drives that sort of efficiency at the rack level. So the new metric that we are really presenting here to all of you is performance per rack. Because of that consistent space constraint and power constraint that are present in a ubiquitous rack across the industry. And as Peter said earlier, this is a choice of 1, 2, or 3 racks. Which would you rather do? You can get into the micro benchmarking or you could even mince whether we use the right database or the right front end web, whatever. We built a composite here to model, but I can tell you that there are many other applications, as Peter introduced earlier, that will perform very, very similarly to this in real world scenarios. So the choice, 1, 2, or 3.
And I think the real thing that's interesting here is, these boxes cost exactly the same. So whether you buy a box that has, Intel in it, or whether you buy a box that has AMD in it, or whether you buy a box that has Ampere in it, they're going to, at the end of the day, street pricing be within a few $100s of each other. So we took the money out of this equation because we know they cost the same. So this really becomes a performance per watt. And you can say, well, it's also per dollar. Yes, because the dollars are the same all the way across the board. And so at the end of the day, what you're looking at is that you're looking at anywhere from a 30 to a 60% reduction in upfront CapEx. And then from there on out, you're looking at anywhere from 30 to 60% reduction in running cost for power, which is rapidly becoming the largest, most variable cost anywhere, whether you're hosting in your own data centers, whether you're in colos, etc. The other thing that's also interesting is it utilizes the rest of the data center infrastructure so much better. Right? The reality is we got, typically 48 port switches sitting up on top of the racks. If you only fill up the rack a third of the way because you run out of power at that point, 2/3 of the switches in your Cisco unit is sitting there and they're laughing at you. They weren't free, right? I mean, it all has a cost.
It all has a cost.
And the same thing, if you go into a colo, you pay by the tile. They don't actually care whether you fill your rack up or not. They still charge you the same. So there's a real heavy economic incentive to go and take a look at this. And I remember when HPE originally brought out ARM in the moonshot environment, 7, 8 years ago. And one of the designers is sitting down here, so CMAC, take a bow. But the reality is that back then we didn't have the ecosystem in place. Today, this is one of the most sold types of new instances at Amazon AWS. So guess what? There is tons of ecosystem around it because otherwise they wouldn't be able to sell it. So just quickly wrapping up here, we actually have the system up and running down at the end of the hall. We're right next to the Ampere booth. And not only do we have the system itself, we have it with all the bells and whistles. OpenBMC is up and running. We got demo folks down there. So come down, take a look. If you're interested in a test drive, by all means, give us a quick shout or just come down and say, hey, can I have a unit so we can try this in the data center? And we would be happy to oblige. With that, I want to say thank you for your time and thank you for your business. Have a great afternoon.
Also, I would like to invite you to join us for cocktails this evening.
Oh,
we will be
that's
down
right.
there, so come and get a cocktail with us, and we would love to see you all. Answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.